The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine takes a big toll on the global energy market. International oil prices surged past $100 a barrel recently amid the conflict, made worse with Western sanctions. U.S. President Joe Biden announced he would impose an energy embargo on Russia, while the European Union also announced that it would seek to significantly reduce oil and gas imports from Russia. Even if all of the world's current spare capacity were to come on stream, it would add as much as only 3.5 million barrels a day, which will still be far short of Russia's daily exports. The energy market is affecting the global economy on a scale not seen since the 1970s, many experts believe. What is the outlook for global energy security? How feasible are measures to speed up production of cheap, clean energy? Joining us, Kevin Tu, Managing Director of Agora Energy Transition. Jia Daojun, Professor of the School of International Studies at Peking University. Peter Kuznick, Professor of History at American University. One crucial question to you, Mr. Tu. Is there a real energy crisis? Is there a crisis of supply?
Given the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian crisis, actually there's a great political pressure for EU to diversify its fossil fuel supply away from Russia, especially in terms of natural gas. So if we're looking ahead, it's possible there will be a supply crisis down the road.
On the other hand, there's geopolitics. For example, the US and some of the others try to block Russia's exports by putting on sanctions on Russia or putting on sanctions that are dealing with Russia. Now, how much do you see the danger of energy crisis?
Well, the United States is in a privileged position here. The United States gets 0% of its gas from Russia and 3% of its oil. But Europe gets 41% of its gas from Russia and somewhere between a quarter and a third of its oil, as well as a lot of coal. So it's easy for the United States to bite the bullet and cut off energy supplies from Russia. It's not so easy, of course, for Europe to do so. I mean, the Europeans are projecting that by next winter, they're going to be cutting their energy supplies from Russia by 2/3. And by 2026, they're going to be getting zero energy from Russia.
How?
You know, that's what they're projecting. We don't know that that's possible, and we don't see plans to make that really possible. So the short-term and medium-term effects of this are going to be very painful for the Europeans to absorb. The U.S. is going to be hurt. And the interesting thing politically is that this could undermine Biden's party, the Democrats' chances in the midterm, and then it could also undermine Biden's chances in 2024.
Right.
So the political ramifications could be significant even in the United States, but the economic or energy ramifications less so.
Yeah, Professor Jia, many have noticed that right after the Russia-Ukraine crisis broke out, Washington has been, this administration, very busy going to Venezuela, trying to reach a deal on the Iran nuclear issue. We know both of these countries are crucial in providing certain kinds of energy for the rest of the world and now possibly for the United States. How do you see these geopolitical priorities streamlining or re-streamlined right after the so-called energy crisis possibility?
I would say that the re-entry of Venezuelan or Iranian energy into the world market is a backup plan for the U.S. and its allies way, way down the road. If I were a U.S. strategist, I might not even push that reality, make that a reality in any immediate future.
How come?
Why? Well, Venezuela traditionally exports to the United States. That's the largest destination. It has established route of doing that industry chain. The spare capacity, quote unquote, will be China. And if you look at the China-Venezuelan joint project in Guangdong, in particular, it's more specifically in the city of Jieyang, it's going to come on up. And also Venezuelan oil being heavy, its price is cheaper. And then when you look at Iranian oil, people talk about 200 million barrels a year, but there is also the refining match, in terms of the refining capacities. Traditionally, Iranian oil goes to two large consumer markets. One is India, the other is China. So I wouldn't think U.S. geostrategists would be happy to see any, re-entry of Iranian or Venezuelan oil into the world market.
Right.
The United States, which has been doing everything it could to marginalize Iran and Venezuela, now feels it's in a position that it's got to bring them into the world economy. It's also been appealing to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. But both of those countries have strengthened their ties to Russia in recent years, and they're not behaving in a very accommodating way to the United States in terms of actually increasing the supply, since the U.S. is requesting them to do.
Right.
The Biden policy has been very critical, for good reason, of Saudi Arabia.
I was trying to talk to some of the Middle Eastern experts on energy before this discussion. It's not like water tap, that you open the tap, you got oil, sending just right to your door. If you close the tap, and it's okay. It's a very complicated, from digging to producing to transporting, and this is a very complicated process. Meanwhile, if the output is being increased, if the market changes, who will pay the cost? Let's just say the market doesn't change, who will pay the cost? The pipeline, when are you going to build that in order to transport all this oil? These are complicated, layer by layer, long-term planning issues that's not likely to solve the problem right now. Yet we see, Mr. Chu, immediate pressure coming from Washington to some of the Middle Eastern countries mentioned by Peter earlier. So how do you see this almost an apparent political, how shall I say, declaration about what really can be done, or what is the real way to solve the problem?
If we look at the potential shortfall of this ongoing crisis, is huge in the global oil market. Last year, Russia is the second largest oil exporter after the Saudi Arabia, and the number is quite high. We're talking about 4.7 million barrels per day of oil exports to the world market. Is about 5% of global oil consumption. Neither Saudi Arabia's spare capacity nor the shale oil industry in the United States, as well as other countries we just discussed, could easily meet the shortfall in the near term. However, if we look at what will happen down the road, if the high oil price persists, it's entirely possible for the world to move away from Russian oil exports. But the problem is we still have a looming energy crisis in the near future. That's a real headache for Western countries, especially the United States.
Professor Zhang, do you see there's a way for the world to find alternatives aside from Russia for energy supply like some of the politicians would love to claim. But is there a real solution immediately?
The immediate solution is to slow down on decarbonization and go back to coal, which will have to happen in Europe and Western European countries, primarily Germany. If it really cuts down on import from Russia, it will have to increase its import of coal from Eastern Europe, which is readily available. But that does help cushion the impact. And then the real challenge or tragedy of this is that earlier you mentioned the UAE, Saudi Arabia, a country that has not often been mentioned as a global source of supply, which more or less is ready to turn its tap wider. That's Qatar. But the Qatari LNG to Europe, it can be an option. But on the other hand, you will have to see a massive retooling of the pipeline systems within Europe. And I would, just to follow on what Professor Kuznik was saying, many Europeans will be finding it tempting to start building up storage capacities just to prepare for the future. So we are really going to have a rather tight situation. Coal, and there are other countries that Indonesia, Australia, or some South Africa, they can increase supply that can help generate electricity, and some spare capacity from Qatar can help a little bit. But to what extent that will make a difference is harder to say. Partly because the United States is limited in its exporting capacity of LNG. It will have to start building up new terminals really fast, and that's going to take years. So we're really in a tight spot.
Just to go to you, Professor Kuznik, since we're talking about the U.S. a little bit, I understand there has been a meeting arranged by this current administration official with some of the major oil companies and energy companies inside the United States recently. And the message is about calling on the business community to act and react and act fast. But the response is coming from the business community rather tame, given what we have already discussed. How do you see this phenomenon before I move to Mr. Chu about the European situation? Now, Professor Kuznik.
I see it affected in two ways. One, they're trying to stop the price gouging. The oil companies, like they always do, are trying to exploit this crisis in order to maximize profits. So that's the first thing that's happening. And the second thing, they're trying to encourage them to do more drilling. What's happened in recent years, the price of crude oil and some of the other energy sources had plummeted a couple of years ago. And so there was not a lot of incentive for new investment. But now there's more incentive. But a lot of these things require, as Professor Zhao was saying, years of preparation.
Indeed.
It's not something you can turn on. The spigot, you said, can't be turned on and off so quickly. But Biden is trying to do that. The answer, and I hope we get to this, in the long-term answer, of course, is renewable energy, green energy, a new green energy economy. If anything good is going to come out of this crisis, it's going to be renewed pressure for renewable energy. In 2020, Europe, 22.1% of Europe's energy came from renewables, which is a sharp increase. If you look at Europe's electricity, 38% came from renewables and only 37% from fossil fuels. So in some areas, this is becoming more viable pretty quickly. And this is going to spur that, I hope. That would be the one good thing to come of this.
The ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine takes a big toll on the global energy market. What is the outlook for global energy security? How feasible are measures to speed up production of cheap, clean energy? Joining us, Kevin Tu, Managing Director of Agora Energy Transition. Jia Daojun, Professor of the School of International Studies at Peking University. Peter Kuznick, professor of history at American University. I understand some companies, some coal energy companies already stopped their production in the process being disassembled already. But now with what's going on with the possible energy crisis, there's a possibility that they're coming back to production. But how much is there real incentive for them, Mr. Tu?
My former employer, International Energy Agency, recently released a 10-point recommendation to the EU regarding how to cut EU's reliance gas exports by 1/3 in just 9 months. If this is doable, it does not necessarily mean it will need to sacrifice the decarbonization agenda. But the problem is when EU is trying to cut off Russian exports in just 9 months by 2/3, then because the magnitude of the cut is much more significant compared with IEA's plan to cut off 1/3 of Russian gas exports in 1 year, then we need to examine other options, like to use more coal-fired power. However, if we look at what's going on in the medium to longer term, this ongoing crisis will only let EU double down its efforts on its Green New Deal, which is also true for what's going on in China and other parts of the world.
With the geopolitics not necessarily just limited to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, China has been talking about more self-reliant on both food security and energy security. Given what happened with the cut of supply chains, some of the crucial part of the supply chains to China as a result of China-US relations, how do you see China's way to achieve the energy security?
I wouldn't characterize Chinese pronouncements as self-reliance. I think the Chinese emphasis is on resilience. Although some analysts would, including mainly Chinese analysts, would emphasize self-reliance against the background of tensions with the US, with or without the Russia-Ukraine situation. I would think at this point of time, Chinese policy projections must be extremely careful. I would think at this point of time, China in policy action should not overreact. And in policy rhetoric, it should be extremely careful because within China, people may emphasize its own vulnerability. But outside China, mainly because our economy is slowing down, but demand is steady, they will look at any Chinese action of, let's say, cherry picking exporters, a sort of import. They would see that as a Chinese weaponization of global energy trade, and that's not in China's interest.
But Mr. Jia, if I could just follow up very politely, how China is doing is not necessarily equal to how others would frame about what they consider China is doing. So those are two very different issues. Let me go to Mr. Tu first. Same question.
Let me throw some number here. China's oil dependence rate currently exceeded 70%, and China relies on gas imports for about 45% of its gas consumption, and also rely on international market to supply about 7 to 8% its coal consumption. In terms of self-reliance, we actually have witnessed what happened in the United States in the past. Before the shale gas revolution, many American administration decried for energy independence. This has never happened unless the market force unleashed the shale gas revolution. Now, United States is actually in a rather nice position to tackle this ongoing geopolitical crisis. The implications for China is, of course, there's certain political gesture in the near term, but what's more important is trying to learn the experience and the lessons from the United States to find a way to kick off the country's own shale gas revolution or similar energy revolution as being called by the top leadership in this country.
Professor Kuznick.
Russia is selling its oil and gas at 20% below market value right now. Russia just today or yesterday concluded some new deals with India. India is also very dependent. India imports 80% of its energy, but only between 2 and 3% of that used to come from Russia. But India, as you know, abstained from that vote in the United Nations. And so India is trying in some ways to play both sides. The US is very committed to getting India to help it against China in the Quad, in its Indo-Pacific policies. But India also has very close relations with Russia. So all of the geopolitics are getting a little bit complicated here.
Yeah.
And you know, that Russian oil's got to go, and gas has got to go somewhere. That's the heart of Russia's economy. You know, more than 45% or an astronomical part of its budget comes from its overseas oil and gas sales. So Russia's going to find an outlet, whether it's Putin in there or it's going to be somebody else. Russia is going to need energy markets, and China will benefit from that. Maybe India will benefit. Maybe Europe is going to find other sources again.
Now, there has been threats coming from Washington particularly about any country dealing with Russia for trade, for energy, and for other things. At this point, still not yet on sanctions of Russia oil, though there are political willingness coming from governments to do so. If there were more sanctions in the financial sector against Russia or anyone who's dealing with Russia, Professor Kuznick.
I think the United States has been obsessed with sanctions for a long time. The U.S. is happy to sanction everybody. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, we didn't hear about the world rising up to sanction the United States, although it deserved to be sanctioned in the same way that Russia deserves to be sanctioned now. But what happened when the U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran was that the Europeans began talking about alternatives to the dollar system in order to buy oil from Iran. They weren't able to figure out a way to do that. But with each one of these crises, I think the world is becoming less and less willing to be held hostage by the Americans. Right now, the thing that makes these sanctions work is that almost all the banks in the world outside of China have been supporting it. So you've got such support from the Europeans. When Biden came to power after the years of Trump, he said what he's going to do is rally and unite the Europeans again. He said the United States is back. We're going to be the world's leaders, and we're going to bring Europe around. Well, he succeeded in doing that in ways that Trump never could have done. But there's a lot of mistrust around the world because right now they're seeing the power of what the United States can do economically to choke off Russia. But a lot of other countries see that that same kind of power can be applied to them. So I think there's great openness to alternative means of financing and means because right now the United States is still able to call the terms, to dictate the terms on this.
I see. Final words also from Professor Jia on this, briefly.
This is, I agree with Peter. He thinks about the impact on the U.S. And the more structural challenge is that what we do is what's called the benchmark currency for the entire world trade. It's very tempting to identify, the party that's causing the stress for everyone. But even with Europe, bear in mind in 2008, the European Union actually passed a law to try to bypass U.S. sanctions against Iran, against using a U.S. dollar for settlement, although later on the actual application was limited. Should the prospect of what Peter just described, more and more countries say, well, wait a minute, today it's Russia, tomorrow it can be me. I better start preparing for the rainy day in terms of the currency of settlement in trade. We are going to be really disrupting a whole lot of the international financial operations. So that's not even in U.S. interest, I would think.
Fascinating conversation, gentlemen. And of course, things are evolving. We would love to call you back and bring us more insights from different perspectives. Thank you so much. Peter Kuznick, Jia Daojun, last but not least, Kevin Tu. Thank you.